Well, welcome, all you wiretappers out there. Back here at the studio of Gangland Wire, I have a particularly interesting show, I think, for you today. It's going to be a little bit different. We're not going to talk about, John Gotti. You probably get sick of talking about John Gotti. I do. And we're not even going to talk about Al Capone, although we may mention his name at some point in time here. But we're going to talk about Mafia genealogy and the origins of the Mafia in Sicily. There's a lot of different stories about that. I know I've heard a few of them, and then in all those different stories, as any historical accounts, somewhere in the middle lies the truth. Now, we never really get to the truth usually, but at least we got some different stories, and we have an expert here. Well, folks, we have a particularly interesting guest today. Justin Cascio. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for having me, Gary.
Well, Justin has a really interesting website. He does some really interesting Mafia history pieces on that website. It's Mafia Genealogy, and he has a Facebook page too. So, just Google Mafia Genealogy, and I promise you'll find Justin's website. And same way as Facebook, just go ahead and search Mafia Genealogy, and you'll find his Facebook page. And he takes a little bit different look at the Mafia. And I just find it fascinating, Justin. It's a lot of work, though. I know that. It's not just finding somebody that's got a story to tell, this Mafia Genealogy, but it tells you so much. So, Justin, tell us, what's the difference in history and genealogy?
The difference between history and genealogy is what happened and who did it. When we talked about this earlier, when we're talking about Mafia genealogy and its relationship to Mafia history, the stories are the meat, but the bones are the genealogy, the people who were involved, and those family relationships that connect them.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and those family relationships in these borgatas, if you will, are hugely important in these families. I mean, I just can look at Kansas City and see that, our boss and his brother were kind of ran the operation, Nick and Corksavella, and their younger brother, Tony Ripe, was an up and comer. And then he's married to the underboss's sister. Tuffy DeLuna is the underboss, and his sister is Molly, and she marries, one of the Savellas. And so it's, but you get to know the families and who begat who, if you will. Then you can start making sense of the stories then and how they're operating. I guess you have to do. I have friends, and my brother does family genealogy. So you got to get in. You got to find death certificates and birth certificates, right?
Absolutely.
And explain kind of how you would do a genealogical search, for example. What would be a step by step how you would do?
I've never done Kansas City. So if I was going to start, I'd find out who the big players were. And I would do that probably by going to somebody like Bill Feather's website, because he keeps a lot of biographical history on the people, and he tells you when they were born and stuff. So that'd be a great place for me to start. And then I would start to try and find those people. I'd start with the boss, and I would look for them in the census records on Family Search. And then in the census records, I'm going to find out what his nuclear family looks like, and maybe even a little of his extended family. Maybe some of his neighbors are important too. And then I would trace him back through the years. Every 10 years, there's another census, and find his marriage, find him with his parents, find out where his parents came from, until I can get back to the old country. And then I've got another set of records that I start looking in there.
That brings up a question. How do you do the old country? That's got to be difficult.
It depends on where you're from. If I get lucky and you're from one of the towns where the documentation is available online, then I'm looking at images of old records. And so I have to be able to read handwriting in Italian and be able to know what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's difficult there. That reading that old handwriting, I've done a little bit of that. Try reading an old will sometime. Oh, your eyes just start glazing over. It's hard to keep. For me, it's hard to maintain my focus. If it's typed, I can do it, but boy, that handwriting is tough. And then now you got another language that makes it even harder. Now, like for example, Corleone, Sicily, or Palermo, certain cities, certain towns have records online. If one of these guys out here tracing their own family heritage back, correct?
Yeah, I'm from Corleone, or my family is, and Corleone has some of the best records available online. There's the civil records, which will cover most of the 1800s, and then there's church records, which go all the way back to about 1600.
Wow, cool. I never thought about that. It never entered my mind. That's really a whole gives this whole mafia history thing that I do a whole different perspective for me to get it more accurate. There's a lot of argument out there online. You do a story and the comments. If you get something wrong, you take some myth that has been perpetuated, from one writer to the other writer to the other writer, and that happens a lot, as we all know. And you say that in a podcast, and boy, they line up down there. Now you got it wrong. It's almost as bad as mispronouncing a name, which I do periodically. They give me hell for that too. But I got a thick skin. Anyhow, this is great to have you here. I was looking at your website, and on your website, guys, you got to take a look at this Mafia genealogy website. Really interesting stuff. And one of the first things that and I mentioned it to you is I had ran into this, and I just thought, well, I guess somebody says Little Sicily and some people say Little Italy, but you point out there's two different areas in Chicago, just outside the loop, Little Italy and Little Sicily. And so there's things like that on there, guys. It's amazing. There's whole stories about that. And Justin has promised to come back and we're going to do a show on that one. So, but that's kind of things. And you look at all the different major cities. And so how do you pick each city out as you go? I know you had New York, Boston, Chicago, and Springfield, Massachusetts, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do you pick out these cities that you go to?
It's been an organic process. My family is deeply rooted in New York. So I was doing a lot of New York at first. And that's how I found my first connections through Ken to a mafioso. I realized that I think it's my second cousin, twice removed, something like that. She married her first cousin, whose cousin is Giuseppe Morello. And then my family, when we moved to New York, we lived in East Harlem on the same block as the Morello Terranova family in about the same time frame that they were living there. And that's how I got started looking at gangsters and getting into mafia history. And so I started with, the Morello family and what it became, the Genovese family, and who else was in town. There's a lot of history in the Lucchese family of people from Corleone. Then I started to get stories from people over time because I'd be writing about what was going on in New York, and then it gets over into Brooklyn. It starts getting me up into Utica. And before you know it, you're in Chicago because I followed Joe Aiello from Utica to Chicago. So I had to understand what his situation was. What was he moving into? And then I was doing this other thing with people from Corleone where I was trying to follow a lot of migrants. I wanted to get lots of data about people moving from Corleone to the United States so that I could compare them with the gangsters that I'd found from Corleone who had made the same move to see if there was anything quantitatively different about them. Were they coming from a different class? Were they coming in through a different port? Were they going into different careers? That kind of thing. And some of the people that I followed coming in through New Orleans were going to Chicago. And then I found the story there about that is on my website about the kidnapping and the bar and the murders around Little Sicily there.
Interesting. That brings out a question. I promised you this would be a little bit organic, dynamic interview, which I like to do. I ran into a deal, and I've given talks around here in Kansas City in the area after I did my movie and about the skimming and big mob war we had here. So people would come up to me and they'd say, "Well, what about the mafia down around Springfield, Missouri, which is Southwest Missouri, and Pittsburgh, Kansas, and Frontenac, Kansas, which is just across the state line into Kansas. Well, what about the mafia down there?" And I said, I don't know. I'm at a loss here because I don't know anything about it. But then as I have gotten into this, and I did a story on Joey Aiuppa from Chicago, and he got his name Joey Doves. And so I'm researching that. And where was he hunting? He was hunting in southeast Kansas, in Frontenac, Kansas, and Pittsburgh, Kansas. And he seemed to have connections down there, and other mobsters were going down there hunting. And so I went down there and I stopped at a kind of a little local history museum. And turns out they had a big coal mining operation down there at the turn of the century, or right after the turn of the century. And they did what they called strip mining. They would just take the dirt off the top and dig out the coal. And she said that when they first got started, the need for laborers, they had tons and tons of Sicilian immigrants come in and created a whole population. That's what happened. So that's the kind of stuff. And then they started dropping names, and actually 2 or 3 of the stores and the restaurants are still people that were there, going all the way back to that time. And when Joey Doves Iupa was down there, so he made connections down there, and they hosted him down there. So that genealogy thing and where people came from, I bet we could find out a lot about the town that they came from, a lot of them, and would explain
whole
even
towns
more.
would all go to the same region. Lots and lots of people would follow their brother, their neighbor, their in-laws. Chain migration, they call it, but it's just the natural way of doing things. It's how people move. It's how we've moved our entire history. And also, it's something that's kind of funny about these people that we're studying that I don't think either one of us thought about before. We look at them as urban people. They're doing their thing in Chicago and New York and Pittsburgh, Kansas City, but they were rural people. They were farmers back in Sicily. And I have all kinds of stories about gangsters going off hunting in the countryside. I mean, it's a part of the Appalachian story. Yeah. It's part of one of the Good Killers stories, the murder in New Jersey. They were supposed to go off hunting together. Another story that I've heard, has Chicago gangsters going out to Oklahoma to the farmland and hanging out in a barn all summer and going out hunting in the daytime as a pastime. They were country people. They came here and they planted sugarcane and they put figs in their backyard and they went hunting. And they, it was, these are some of the traditions that they brought with them and kept.
Yeah, if you think about Carlos Marcello down in New Orleans, he had several thousand acres of land, and he raised goats, and the goats were, sold for meat. And he had a huge big farm, which was kind of like his, country retreat, but it was a working farm also.
If you imagine who they looked up to in Sicily, the men with a lot of money, they would have probably had goats, and they went hunting, and they lived in the country in the big estates.
Don Corleone, the Godfather, the fictional Godfather, he's out tending his grapes there at the end. He's got his little
on Long Island. Yeah.
Anyhow, so what I want to talk about, and I think my guys would like to hear, and we want to hear from you, Justin, is about how this thing got started in Sicily. There's a lot of different stories. So kind of lead us into that.
Sure. Some of the legends would have you believe that the Mafia is hundreds and hundreds of years old, that it goes all the way back to the Sicilian Vespers in the 1200s, which was one of the revolts of the people of Sicily against their foreign king. To get him out of there, thinking if we get rid of this king, we'll get to rule ourselves. And that never really happened for Sicily. But there was a series of kicking the old guy out and then hoping they're going to get to do their own thing. But then some other king invariably comes in and starts leading them instead. And so you have a series of different rulers in Sicily all through history. Going back, to the Emirate, but even before the Emirate, it was Rome that held Sicily as basically a giant penal colony. Not a penal colony, but a slave colony. It was nothing but agriculture and slaves. And that was the beginning of Sicily. And so that's what it grew up out of. And it's always been people being ruled by somebody from far away, having the raw riches of the island mined up or grown and then shipped away, never developing the island, never building roads, schools, industry. So it was always underdeveloped and kept primitive so that it was easy to suppress. And so the legends that grew up in Sicily are about overcoming that history, throwing the guy out for real. And but they're not true. and the Mafia story of the Sicilian Vespers is not true. The Mafia is probably about as old as the Italian Republic, so about 1860. Some people will give it.
I have a question about that because I know this is going to come up. The Sicilian Vespers. Now, we have this story that got popularized. One of the early books I read about the Mafia back when I was in my early 20s, they talked about the night that, or the day or the evening that Luciano and I think Mayor Lansky, and they killed, I think it was Maranzano, and then several other mob guys were killed. And it's claimed that that was the night of the Sicilian Vespers, and Lucky Luciano took over everything. And then other people say, no, those guys were killed, for some other reason. They didn't have anything. There wasn't any big, night of killing off people. Then there's, stuff in between. So you're talking about the Sicilian Vespers way back then. Explain when you say Sicilian Vespers, what are you talking about?
Sure. 1260 something, the Sicilian Vespers. The king is from what will be France, the Angevin dynasty. And so he has French soldiers in the city of Palermo, and they're being disrespectful to people. And according to the legend, a soldier either insulted or assaulted or raped, depending on the story you get, a young woman, and her mother cried out, for help, and men came, and then that was the beginning of the revolution. Okay. So that's the story of the Sicilian Vespers. Okay. And I don't know how much truth there is to the actual flashpoint of it, but that's the one that we get in the Mafia the Mafia legend. Good. And then what you're talking about is 1931, end of the Castello Marese War. And Joe Valachi told us another legend, which is that a bunch of gangsters got killed that day as part of kind of a clean slate situation. But that didn't happen either, as we've learned from more contemporary historians of the Mafia.
Okay, I'm sorry. I hope you can pick up back about where you were. But
no problem. So the real Mafia origins were probably in the countryside of Western Sicily. And around 1830s is where I would put the start of Mafia. The first documented incidents of a Mafia ring was from 1838, I want to say, and it was about a gangster. It was about a guy from Corleone. His name was Luca Patti, and I was able to find his baptismal record, his marriage record, trace his family tree. I know who his descendants are. And so he's one of the very first gangsters that mafiosi that we know of in history, because somebody wrote to some other government official about this guy who's stealing cattle and running them from Trapani to Palermo. And at the same time, or around the same time, I've documented another gang of cattle rustlers that were based in Corleone that the police rounded up and mostly executed. And their families, I've also traced their descendants. And their families continue to be important in the Mafia in Corleone, even for generations afterward. So it's really a family business.
Interesting. Well, it's a family, la familia. Interesting. And so from that, then how was it exported? This kind of family in the Corleone area, did that get exported to other villages around Sicily and kind of start taking on some popularity of its own? Did they really, as legend would have it, become like the shadow government? They got tired of the government from Rome, from northern Italy, coming in and dispensing justice. And so if you wanted justice, you went to the local godfather. How did that then develop from that kind of that single base there in Corleone?
Part of the history of Sicily being neglected in the way that it was is that they didn't have a lot of police. So what happened in Sicily stayed in Sicily. If you wanted justice, you were going to have to get it on your own. People were living under a feudal system until like 1812, I want to say. I'm always a little fuzzy on my dates. But even after that time period, they continued to live in the same way, which is that they were completely dependent on the local estate for their work. And there was a gabellotto who would be the one who would hire them to work on the estate. And that guy had so much power in town that he became the boss. He was the mafia boss of the town, or one of them. And that system, it did get exported in a way, because a lot of the agricultural workers in the who came to the United States to work, in New Orleans, in that area, would go through a padrone. They would have somebody who was more experienced from Sicily, but more experienced in living in the United States, who would be their middleman, who would help connect them with a job and a place to live and tickets home. And before there was Western Union, a way to send your money back home, that kind of thing. I wouldn't say that the mafia was exported just from Corleone. It seems to be one of those things where it was being invented in a lot of different places all at once, because everybody was, they had a culture in common. They had certain ways of making their families in common. Western Sicily is different from the rest of the island because it's where there was more Arab influence. It's where Palermo is. It's just a little different in a lot of different ways that have made it a unique kind of a place to breed a mafia. It was neglected, but it had all this wealth, but it's really unequal. And this culture of you protect your family first, and you really can't trust outsiders because the outsiders change every few generations. The people who you can trust are the ones who are local, who have always been there, their families. And that culture stuck around, for a few generations after emigration too. People still, turn to their father for permission to start a business or get married or things like that. So that part of the culture was constant, and that's something that the mafia builds upon. It's not that culture alone is the mafia, but the mafia definitely is dependent upon that Sicilian culture. When that culture changes, the mafia has to change a lot.
Interesting. So when they came to the United States, many people moved around the church and in the same neighborhood. I know that's what we have in Kansas City. And historically, in Little Italy or Columbus Park now in Kansas City, it's always was known as the safe place. You could leave your camera on your seat of your car and the windows down, and nobody's ever going to take it down in Little Italy. And so that's what I'm hearing about these neighborhoods when it first started over there, that they stuck together, and you better not be hurting your neighbors, and especially not be an outsider and do anything. So does that sound right? Is that kind of how that myth developed over here?
I don't know. I mean, when you talk about that, I think about the women in my neighborhood growing up, like the women who would hang out on their stoops, who knew what was going on in the neighborhood. And if somebody who wasn't from town came down the street, they would know. Mm-hmm. And they'd be talking about it. They'd call their neighbor. Did you see that guy?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a good police presence and you're a really isolated community, like a Sicilian town, a stranger's going to stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah. Interesting. No, so did then the padrone over there, then he settled differences between relatives and neighbors, I would have to assume. He was like the overall judge of what was going on legally. You didn't go to court. You had the padrone settle all your differences. Is that how that worked?
Tended to be that way, yeah. Or if you couldn't work it out between your two families' heads, if they couldn't work it out, then you might take it to the padrone. The court systems were really inaccessible to most people because it was very expensive to get a lawyer. There were multiple different court systems. Mm-hmm. Like, how in the United States you can be taken up before a military court, mm-hmm. state court, and there's federal court, but I think that's about it. In Sicily, there was a church court. Every single professional guild had their own court system. A lord who owned their property and was titled had domain over it and could judge cases in his property. So it was like everybody there were so many different overlapping systems of justice that the result was there was no justice. You could destroy your neighbor by dragging him through the courts forever and ever until he ran out of money. But if you're poor, you couldn't even get in. It was just you needed to settle things outside of the courts in an informal way.
Interesting. Well, that's, what you're telling me, it makes a lot more sense about the development of the culture here in the United States. Is then, they come to the United States and they have to, they find a good court system but yet you're kind of squeezed out because you're not given government jobs. You can't get jobs. You have to start your own little businesses, and you live together. You share a language and a religion, and you're a little bit different from the Protestants that were running everything when they got here. And so it's really making a lot more sense now. They brought that system with them, and so slowly but surely they've integrated into the larger society, become part of it. But it just takes a while.
It was, and they did get resistance. Like the Catholic churches in the United States were dominated by Irish Catholics, and they really resented the Italians. So the Italians wound up either being in the basement or making their own church eventually that was separate from the Irish church.
Yeah.
And, kids had to go to school. So there was that. But then most of the work that the Italian immigrants were doing was entry-level stuff. There was a lot of them did work for the city. I see a lot of people who were street cleaners. They worked in the sewers. They dug tunnels. Yeah. They were building streets. They were building America.
The laborer's job. The Irish had the cop jobs, and
they got to move on
the good jobs the Irish had.
Yeah, there's a theory about crime and that social ladder, that when you are at the bottom of the ladder, crime is one of the ways up to the next rung. And you see that again and again with individual mafiosi, the way that they conduct themselves. If they become successful and they avoid prison and they make enough money, what do? They move their family out to the suburbs. It really is Tony Soprano all over again.
Yes. We had it here for sure. They all moved from Little Italy to the same neighborhood, but the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been great. This is really interesting. Justin, do you have anything else you'd like to add about that? Anything you felt like people would like to know about that feudal system or the development of the mafia? I guess I maybe have a question. Over on the mainland, they have the Camorra and the 'Ndrangheta.
Yeah,
that's from out of Naples, and the other one was from more the Adriatic side. I can't remember which is which, but how did those develop compared to the mafia? Because we're talking about Sicilian mafia, which is a different animal than the Camorra and the 'Ndrangheta.
Right. The two mainland groups that you're talking about, they both evolved independently, separate from Sicily. They have some similarities, but in some ways they're a little more entrenched, like what I've read about the Camorra. I'm not really strong on the Camorra and the 'Ndrangheta because they're not really my areas.
Okay, I think what's important here, and I'll edit this, is that they're different. They didn't come out of that. They developed separately on their own. I think. And you said that. I think that's the point. I think that's good enough. You don't need to go into that whole history.
Although something interesting about them is that they also transplanted to the United States. So you find towns like Springfield, Mass, where the native mafia is almost entirely made up of people who came from Camorra strongholds in Naples.
Interesting. And it seems like in Canada, in Montreal, the Rizzutos, I think they were Sicilian, but there was another family up there in maybe was it Toronto that was primarily Camorra. So they must have all come from that same city. Is that? Yeah,
the whole region of Naples has got Camorra in it. And so there's a couple of towns that all seem to come to Springfield. And you see the same sort of pattern happening from other towns. They'll all come from one little village and they'll all pick this one place in the middle of nowhere, and you wonder why they're there. And it's just because one of them got there and was like, "It's good, come."
Yeah, interesting. I tell you, one of the more interesting towns, we're going to have to do a whole show on this, is Chicago. Al Capone his family's from Naples, and he created this organization that we call today the Outfit. They don't call it the Mafia. And they didn't even used to have making ceremonies like the Mafia does in Chicago until later on when IUPA was Sicilian. And I understand they finally started doing some, Sicilian Mafia making ceremonies. So that whole, he brought in Sicilians and other people from Naples and Jewish people and Greek, and he brought everything in to make this outfit. In some places they'll call it a combination, like in I think Detroit they called it the combination. So they bring people in. They don't call it the Mafia; they call it something other name.
It's a smart development.
It was at Al Capone. That guy was a genius.
You're in America; you got to do it differently here.
Yes, he could really adapt to circumstances. All right. Well, Justin, this has been great. Folks, you need to go out and check the Mafia Genealogy website, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes and on the YouTube notes down below, and also his Facebook page, and like and subscribe or whatever, have you do that to the Facebook page, and like and subscribe to my YouTube page, of course, but get on his, do you have a mailing list out of your Mafia Genealogy when you put out a new story?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't. But I have a Patreon.
Okay. All right. Got a Patreon there. Support him, guys. But we do this work and we give you a lot of entertainment and a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, and we do it just, out of the goodness of our hearts, but you got the expenses too. I know those websites, you got to keep paying a certain amount of money. Then it needs updating, and then it needs this, and then something happens. I don't know what to do. So you got to hire somebody to fix that. I know there's always something.
I always need a book.
Really? All right. Justin Cascio, I really appreciate you coming on Mafia Genealogy, and this has been some great stories. Thanks a lot, Justin.
It's been fun, Gary. Thanks.
Well, guys, that was Justin Cascio of the Mafia Genealogy website. It's a really cool website. I suggest you go take a look at it. A lot of good stories you haven't heard before. And I'm going to do some more with him of those old stories. Don't forget to look out for motorcycles, because y'all know I ride a motorcycle, although the motorcycle season is just about to the end. I'd say it'll probably be a few more days I can zip out. I like to take them out at least once every month and drive them around the block or something. I'm looking at signing up for a motorcycle school out in Las Vegas. So I'll contact some of you guys that live out in Las Vegas maybe, and I'll come out there next spring. Not sure if it's going to come off yet or not. Don't forget, if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, or if you know somebody and they've been in the service, got a problem with PTSD, go to the VA website and get that hotline number and give them a call. There's a lot of help available. Thanks a lot, guys. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this with your friends. That's the best way you can support the podcast now is tell somebody about it and get them started down this path with us. We have a lot of fun here. Thanks, guys. Fun here. Thanks, guys. Fun here. Thanks, guys. Fun here. Thanks, guys.